Good evening, dear listeners, and a very warm welcome to you all. Wherever you are tuning in from tonight, maybe cozied up in bed, listening from your favorite quiet corner at home, or perhaps relaxing somewhere peaceful with the world fading away outside, I'm so glad you've joined me here. Take a slow, deep breath, let your shoulders drop, maybe pull the covers up a bit higher, and feel the day gently slip away. Let the story begin. The fog clung to the Gironde like a shroud as Hercule Poirot stepped from the chauffeur-driven Renault onto the gravel drive of Chateau sur Mer, a grand stone edifice overlooking Bordeaux's Medoc vineyards. It was December 1935, the holiday season, yet no cheer lighted the windows. Inside, the air carried the scent of oak and old wine, until a scream shattered the stillness. Lord Reginald Hargrove, the chateau's English owner and renowned collector, lay dead in the vast wine cellar, a half-empty bottle of 1929 Chateau Lafite at his side, his face contorted in agony. Poison, the local doctor declared, but Poirot, invited as a guest of honor for the holiday vintage tasting, knew better. "This is no accident," he murmured, moustache twitching. "This is murder most methodical." Chapter 1. Arrival at the Chateau. The Renault glided to a halt on the gravel drive of Chateau sur Mer, its tires crunching softly in the December dusk. Hercule Poirot emerged, adjusting the collar of his overcoat against the damp chill that rose from the Gironde estuary. The air carried the faint, earthy perfume of winter vineyards, bare vines stretching in orderly rows toward the horizon, their dark tendrils glistening under a low, pewter sky. It was December 23, 1935, and the holiday season had settled over Bordeaux like a velvet curtain, heavy with expectation and secrets. Poirot paused to survey the chateau. The stone facade rose 3 stories, its windows tall and mullioned, reflecting the last amber light of day. Gargoyles perched along the eaves, their stone faces worn by centuries of rain. This was no mere country house. It was a fortress of wealth and tradition, built in the reign of Louis XIV and expanded by English owners who had fallen in love with the Medoc. Lord Reginald Hargrove had purchased it 20 years earlier, drawn by its cellars and the promise of vintages that could make a man immortal in the eyes of connoisseurs. A butler in black tails opened the heavy oak door before Poirot could raise the brass knocker. "Monsieur Poirot, welcome. Lord Hargrove awaits you in the drawing room." The interior was warm, almost suffocating after the cold outside. Fires blazed in 2 massive hearths, their light dancing across panelled walls hung with hunting tapestries and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Crystal decanters caught the glow like captured stars. The scent of beeswax polish mingled with the deeper notes of old oak and leather-bound books. Lord Hargrove stood by the larger fireplace, a robust man of 60, his cheeks florid, his white hair neatly combed. He wore a velvet smoking jacket, the color of burgundy, and his eyes twinkled with the satisfaction of a host who knows his guests are about to be dazzled. "Poirot, my dear fellow, you've arrived just in time. The vintage tasting tomorrow night will be the event of the season. Come, let me introduce you." He gestured to the small assembly already gathered. Lady Eleanor Hargrove, his wife, sat in an armchair near the window, her posture impeccable. She was a striking woman in her late 40s, with pale skin, dark hair swept into a low chignon, and eyes the color of storm clouds. Her emerald silk dress shimmered as she inclined her head in greeting, but her smile did not reach those eyes. Beside her stood Vicomte Philippe de Montfort, a tall, lean figure of 40, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit. His features were handsome, almost too perfect, with a thin moustache and hair slicked back. He regarded Poirot with the polite curiosity of a man accustomed to being the most interesting person in any room. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, offering a firm handshake, "your reputation precedes you. I look forward to seeing those famous little grey cells at work, though I trust our gathering will be free of crime." Poirot inclined his head. "One can only hope, Vicomte." Miss Beatrice Langford, Lord Hargrove's private secretary, stood a little apart, clutching a leather-bound notebook. She was young, perhaps 28, slender, with brown hair pinned neatly, and spectacles that magnified her serious eyes. She nodded politely, but said nothing, her gaze flickering toward Lord Hargrove with an intensity that suggested both loyalty and something more guarded. Captain Roland Thorne, Hargrove's nephew and heir apparent, lounged against the mantelpiece, a glass of sherry in hand. He was 35, broad-shouldered, with the easy charm of a man who has never lacked for money or attention. His blonde hair was slightly tousled, his uniform jacket unbuttoned at the collar. "So you're the famous detective," he said, grinning. "Uncle Reggie swears you're the only man who can tell a Margot from a Lafitte blindfolded. Care to wager on tomorrow's tasting?" Poirot smiled thinly. "I do not wager, Captain. I observe." The last member of the party was Monsieur Jacques Lefebvre, the cellar master. A small, wiry man in his late 50s, he wore a dark apron over a white shirt, and his hands were stained with the faint purple of wine. His face was weathered, etched with lines from years spent underground among barrels and bottles. He bowed slightly, eyes bright with pride. "Monsieur Poirot, it is an honor. The cellars are ready for your inspection." Lord Hargrove clapped his hands. "Excellent. Now, to the matter at hand. Tomorrow evening we shall unveil the pièce de résistance, a full case of 1929 Chateau Lafitte, purchased directly from the chateau itself, the vintage of the century, gentlemen and lady, the wine that survived the phylloxera, the war, and the crash. Tomorrow we shall taste it and toast the holiday season." He led them to a side table where a single bottle stood under a velvet cloth. With a flourish, he drew the cloth aside. The label was pristine, the paper slightly yellowed, the ink still sharp. Chateau Lafitte Rothschild, 1929. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the room. Vicomte de Montfort leaned closer. "Magnificent. I tried to acquire this lot myself." "But you outbid me, Hargrove." A bitter defeat. Hargrove laughed. "All's fair in love and wine, Philippe. Besides, I intend to share it generously." Lady Eleanor rose gracefully. "Do be careful, Reginald. Such treasures should not be squandered on a whim." Her tone was light, but there was an edge to it. Hargrove waved her off. "Nonsense, Eleanor. This is a celebration." Miss Langford cleared her throat. "The invitations are confirmed, my lord. The local vintners, the mayor, and a few journalists from Paris will arrive at 7. Captain Thorne drained his glass. "And I shall be here to ensure the evening doesn't end too early." Poirot watched them all, noting the small gestures, the way Lady Eleanor's fingers tightened on her glass, the flicker of envy in the Vicomte's eyes, the quiet vigilance of Miss Langford, the careless bravado of Captain Thorne, and the almost reverent gaze of Monsieur Lefebvre as he stared at the bottle. Lord Hargrove lifted his own glass. "To the 1929 vintage and to the holiday season, may our cellars remain full and our friends faithful." They drank. Poirot, abstaining from alcohol, raised his tisane in silent salute. The fire crackled. The fog pressed against the windows, and somewhere deep beneath their feet, in the cool darkness of the cellars, the great bottles waited. As the evening drew to a close, Lord Hargrove excused himself. "I shall descend to the cellar for a private toast," he announced. "One last look at my treasures before tomorrow's revelry." He took a candle from the mantel and disappeared through the door that led to the stone staircase. The others lingered in conversation, but Poirot remained by the fireplace, his gaze thoughtful. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the vineyards. The chateau settled into silence, save for the distant drip of water in the cellars far below. Tomorrow would bring the tasting, the laughter, the toasts. But tonight, in the quiet, something waited, something that had no patience for celebration. Chapter 2. The Discovery. The first pale light of dawn crept through the tall windows of the chateau, turning the fog outside to a ghostly silver. The household stirred slowly, servants moving quietly along the corridors with trays of coffee and fresh bread. Poirot, who had risen early, as was his custom, stood at the head of the grand staircase, his small hands clasped behind his back, watching the world awaken. It was then that the scream came, sharp, piercing. It echoed from the depths of the chateau like a knife through silk. Poirot's head snapped toward the sound. It came from below, from the cellars. He descended swiftly, his polished shoes clicking on the stone steps. The air grew cooler with every step, carrying the familiar scent of damp limestone and aging wine. At the bottom, the heavy oak door to the cellars stood ajar. Monsieur Lefebvre was there already, his face ashen, hands trembling. Behind him, a young footman knelt on the flagstones, retching into a handkerchief. Lord Reginald Hargrove lay sprawled among the racks, his velvet smoking jacket twisted around him, one arm flung wide. A single candle had guttered out beside him, leaving a puddle of wax. A half-empty glass rested near his right hand, its contents dark and undisturbed. The famous bottle of 1929 Chateau Lafite stood upright on a small table nearby, cork still in place, label pristine. But Hargrove's face told the story. His lips were drawn back in a rictus of agony, eyes wide and staring, pupils fixed in death. Froth flecked his mouth. Strychnine, Poirot thought immediately. The symptoms were unmistakable. The rigid limbs, the arched back, the expression of torment frozen forever. Lady Eleanor appeared at the doorway, clutching a shawl around her shoulders. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry. "What has happened?" she asked, voice steady. "He is dead," Lefebvre whispered. "My lord is dead." Captain Thorne pushed past her, his uniform jacket thrown hastily over his pajamas. "Good God!" He knelt beside the body, fingers searching for a pulse that was long gone. "Uncle Reggie, how?" Vicomte de Montfort arrived last, hair still damp from a quick wash. His expression was carefully composed, but his gaze flicked to the bottle. "Poison," he murmured. Poirot stepped forward, careful not to disturb the scene. He knelt beside the body, examining without touching. The glass held perhaps 2 inches of wine. The bottle itself appeared untouched. No signs of a struggle, no overturned racks, no broken glass scattered on the floor. Only the unnatural stillness of death. "The doctor must be summoned," Poirot said quietly. "And the police." Lady Eleanor nodded. "I shall telephone at once." As she hurried away, Poirot turned to Lefebvre. "You discovered him?" The cellar master nodded, voice hoarse. "I came down at first light to check the temperature in the lower vaults. The door was open. I thought perhaps my lord had forgotten to lock it after his private toast last night." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "He came down alone?" "Yes, monsieur, he often did. To sit among his treasures," he said. "To think." Captain Thorne stood abruptly. "Suicide? Uncle Reggie would never—" "Non," Poirot said firmly. "This is not suicide. The contortions, the agony, they speak of strychnine. A painful death. A man who chooses suicide does not select such a method." He rose and examined the bottle more closely. The cork was driven home firmly, the wax seal unbroken. Yet the glass beside the body had been poured from this bottle, or so it appeared. He lifted the glass carefully by the stem, sniffed. The rich, velvety aroma of black currant, cedar, and earth rose up, but beneath it lingered something faint, almost metallic. "The poison was not in the bottle," Poirot murmured. "It was in the glass." Miss Langford had appeared silently at the doorway, notebook in hand as always. Her face was white, but her voice was calm. "Shall I fetch the doctor's bag from the hall, monsieur?" Poirot glanced at her. "No, leave everything as it is. The police will wish to see." The doctor arrived within the hour, a brisk, middle-aged man from the nearby village, Dr. Moreau. He confirmed what Poirot already knew: death by strychnine poisoning, administered sometime in the night. Time of death likely between midnight and 3 o'clock. The body was already beginning to stiffen. As Moreau prepared to remove the body, Poirot made a final observation. The cellar key, large, iron, distinctive, hung from a hook beside the door. Hargrove's copy, no doubt. Lefebvre had his own, and he swore it had never left his possession. "Only 2 keys, Lefebvre said. "Mine and his lordship's." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And yet the door was open this morning. Someone unlocked it, or left it unlocked." The doctor departed with the body, promising a full report. The household gathered in the drawing-room, the fire now burning low. No one spoke for a long moment. Lady Eleanor broke the silence. Reginald was a man of enemies, perhaps, but poison in his own cellar. Vicomte de Montfort lit a cigarette with steady hands. A rival collector, someone who could not bear to see the Lafitte in another's hands? Captain Thorne paced, or someone who stood to gain from his death? The will, the inheritance. Miss Langford said nothing, but her fingers tightened on her notebook. Poirot stood by the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded vineyards. "We must not jump to conclusions," he said softly. "But one thing is certain. This murder was planned with precision. The killer knew Lord Hargrove's habits, knew he would come alone to the cellar, knew which bottle he would choose. He turned to face them. And that means the killer is one of us." The words hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the fog thickened, and the chateau seemed to hold its breath. The holiday season had begun in shadow, and the vintage tasting, now impossible to cancel, loomed like a grim promise. Poirot's eyes moved from face to face. Lady Eleanor's cool composure, the Vicomte's guarded gaze, Captain Thorne's restless energy, Miss Langford's quiet watchfulness, Lefebvre's trembling hands. Chapter 3. The Legend of the Vintage. The drawing-room felt smaller in the grey light of morning, the fire reduced to embers. The guests had gathered there at Poirot's quiet suggestion, as if the familiar walls might offer some protection from the truth that had crept into their midst. Coffee steamed in porcelain cups, but no one drank. The silence was broken only by the distant tick of the grandfather clock and the occasional creak of settling wood. Poirot stood before the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, his small figure somehow commanding the room. He had spent the past hour in the cellar, alone, examining every detail: the position of the body, the angle of the spilled candle wax, the faint smudge on the glass that might have been a fingerprint or simply dust. Now he was ready. "Mes amis," he began, his voice calm and precise, "we must speak plainly. Lord Hargrove has been murdered. The poison was strychnine, administered in the glass he drank from last night. The bottle of 1929 Lafitte remains untainted. The killer knew his habits, his tastes, his routines. This was no crime of passion, but one of careful calculation." Lady Eleanor sat rigidly in her chair, fingers laced tightly in her lap. "You speak as if we are all suspects." "Monsieur Poirot, are we not?" he replied gently. The chateau was locked, the cellars accessible only by those who hold keys or were already inside. The guests arrived yesterday afternoon. The servants have been here for years. The circle is small." Vicomte de Montfort exhaled a thin stream of cigarette smoke. "Then let us begin with motive. Why would anyone wish to kill Reginald?" Captain Thorne, leaning against the mantel, laughed without humor. "Money, perhaps. Uncle Reggie was not a generous man. He controlled everything. The estate, the cellars, the fortune. My inheritance is substantial, but only if he dies before changing his will again." Poirot's eyes flickered toward him. "You have debts, Captain?" Thorne's jaw tightened. "Who doesn't these days? The war left me with certain obligations, but I would not murder my own uncle." "Debts can be powerful motives," Poirot observed. "Yet you have an alibi. You were playing cards with the footman until nearly midnight, yes?" Thorne nodded, "And I went straight to bed." Miss Langford, seated at the edge of the group, spoke quietly. Lord Hargrove was fond of his cellar. He often went down alone at night, especially after a glass or two. It was a ritual. Lefebvre, standing near the door, shifted uncomfortably. "The wines are not just bottles, monsieur. They are history. The 1929 vintage. It is the finest Bordeaux has ever known. The weather that year. Perfect sun, perfect rain. The grapes ripened in a way that may never be repeated." Lord Hargrove bought the entire remaining case from Chateau Lafite himself. It was his pride. Poirot turned to him. "And yet, Monsieur Lefebvre, you have spent your life in those cellars. You know every bottle, every label." The cellarmaster's eyes widened. "You cannot think I would harm the wines." "No," Poirot said, "but perhaps the man who owned them." A sudden chill seemed to settle over the room. Lady Eleanor spoke, her voice low. "There is a story about that vintage. A legend, really." All eyes turned to her. "In 1929, she continued, the original owner of the Lafite estate died suddenly, poisoned by a rival who coveted the barrels. The story goes that the man cursed the vintage before he died, that anyone who drank from those bottles would meet the same fate." Reginald dismissed it as nonsense, of course. He laughed at superstition. "But he kept the bottle we saw last night in a place of honor, separate from the others." Vicomte de Montfort stubbed out his cigarette. "A curse? Come now, Eleanor. We are in the 20th century. Yet the man is dead," she said simply. "Poisoned, like the legend says." Poirot's moustache twitched. "A convenient legend, one that might be revived to cover a more mundane motive." He walked to the window and looked out at the fog-shrouded vineyards. "The curse is a red herring, perhaps, but it serves a purpose. To make the death seem inevitable, almost fated. To deflect from the true killer." Captain Thorne straightened. "If there is a codicil in the will, as I suspect, it may explain things. Uncle Reggie loved puzzles. He once told me that the cellar would go to the person who could solve a riddle he left in his study. A final test of worthiness." Miss Langford nodded. "There is a sealed envelope in the desk. He instructed me never to open it unless he was gone." Poirot's eyes brightened. "Then we shall open it." He led the way to the study, a small panelled room lined with books and maps of the Medoc. On the desk lay a cream-coloured envelope, sealed with red wax bearing Hargrove's crest. Poirot broke the seal carefully and unfolded the single sheet of paper. The handwriting was bold and unmistakable. "To my heirs and guests, the key to my cellar is not in gold or deeds, but in understanding. Solve the riddle, and the vintage is yours. I am taken from a mine and shut up in a wooden case, from which I am never released, and yet I am used by almost everybody. What am I?" Poirot read it aloud, then looked up. "A classic riddle. The answer is pencil-lead, graphite from a mine, encased in wood." Lady Eleanor frowned. "But what does it mean?" "It means," Poirot said, "that Lord Hargrove believed the true value of his cellar lay not in the wine, but in the knowledge and appreciation of it. The winner would be the one who understood this." Captain Thorne snorted. So he would have given it away to a stranger who solved a riddle? Perhaps, Poirot replied. Or perhaps he intended it for someone specific. He folded the paper and placed it back on the desk. But this is not the moment for riddles. The police will arrive soon. Until then, we must consider who had the opportunity and the knowledge to poison the glass. He turned to Lefebvre. You have a key to the cellar, monsieur. You knew he would go down alone. Lefebvre paled. I would never. Poirot held up a hand. No accusations yet, only possibilities. Outside, the fog began to lift slightly, revealing rows of naked vines stretching into the distance. The holiday was still 2 days away, but the chateau had already entered a season of suspicion, and Poirot, standing in the center of the study, felt the first stirrings of certainty in his little grey cells. Chapter 4. Motives Unveiled. The study door closed softly behind them, sealing the group in the quiet intimacy of the room. The air smelled of old leather and cigar smoke, remnants of Lord Hargrove's evening habits. Poirot had placed the riddle note back in its envelope, but the words lingered in everyone's minds like an unspoken accusation. He moved to the window, drawing back the heavy curtain just enough to let in a sliver of pale daylight. We must now speak of motives, he said, turning to face them. For a murder such as this is never without reason, and the reason, I believe, lies in the heart of this household. Lady Eleanor drew herself up, her emerald dress catching the light. If you are implying that I had cause to wish my husband dead, Monsieur Poirot, you are mistaken. Reginald and I had our differences, yes. He was possessive, jealous of my friendships, but I would not kill him. Poirot regarded her calmly. And yet, Lady Eleanor, you were overheard arguing with him 2 weeks ago in this very room, about a gentleman in Paris. An artist, I believe. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Servants gossip. Yes, we argued. He threatened to cut me off without a penny if I pursued the matter, but I did not poison him. Threats of disinheritance, Poirot murmured. A strong motive, perhaps. The will leaves you only the London house and a modest annuity. The chateau and the cellars go elsewhere. Captain Thorne shifted uncomfortably. To me, I suppose. Uncle Reggie always said I'd inherit the estate, but he changed his mind last year after that business in Monte Carlo. Said I needed to grow up. Poirot nodded. And now, with his death, the inheritance is yours, debts and all. Thorne's face darkened. I didn't kill him for money. He was family. Vicomte de Montfort leaned against a bookcase, arms folded. If we are listing motives, then I must confess mine. Reginald outbid me at auction for the Lafitte case. Twice. I wanted those bottles more than anything. But murder? None. I would rather buy them from his estate. Miss Langford had remained silent, standing near the desk with her notebook clutched to her chest. Poirot turned to her now. And you, Mademoiselle Langford? You were his secretary for 5 years. You knew his secrets, his routines, his weaknesses. She swallowed. I was loyal to him, Monsieur Poirot. Yet loyalty can turn to resentment. He promised you something, did he not? A future beyond secretarial duties. Her eyes widened. How did you? Poirot smiled faintly. It is my business to notice. The way you looked at him, the small gestures, and the codicil in his will. He intended to acknowledge you, did he not? To make you his heir in some way. Miss Langford's face flushed. He was my father. My mother was a maid here years ago. He never acknowledged me publicly, but he provided for my education, my position. He said when the time was right, he would change the will, include me as a daughter. Lady Eleanor's eyes narrowed. So you stood to gain the most, the cellars, the fortune, everything. I did not kill him, Miss Langford said, voice trembling. He was going to make it right. Why would I destroy that? Lefebvre, who had been hovering near the door, spoke up. My lord was a good man. He loved the wines, the land. He would not have abandoned any of you. Poirot studied the cellar master. And you, Monsieur Lefebvre, 30 years in these cellars. You know every bottle, every cork. You could have poisoned the glass in seconds. Lefebvre's hands clenched. I live for the wines. They are my life. Lord Hargrove understood that. He never threatened to sell the cellar. Yet he had debts, Poirot said quietly. The estate is not as prosperous as it appears. The vineyards suffered in the last vintage. He spoke of selling part of the collection to pay creditors. Lefebvre paled. He would not. Perhaps he would. And that would have been the end of your world. The room fell silent. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed the hour. 11 o'clock. Outside, the fog had lifted enough to reveal the vineyards. Their rows stark and bare. Poirot paced slowly. So we have motives aplenty. The wife scorned, the heir in debt, the rival collector, the unrecognized daughter, the devoted servant who fears loss. Each of you had reason. Each of you had opportunity. He stopped in front of the desk. But opportunity alone is not enough. The poison was strychnine. Where would one obtain such a thing? It is not common household fare. Captain Thorne frowned. The gardener uses it for rats in the stables. A tin in the tool shed, Poirot nodded. Precisely. And the tin is missing half its contents. Someone took it. Lady Eleanor rose. You cannot accuse us all. This is intolerable. I accuse no one yet, Poirot said. But I observe. And soon the little grey cells will speak. He moved to the door. The police will arrive this afternoon. Until then, no one leaves the chateau. The cellars remain locked. And tonight, we will dine together, as Lord Hargrove would have wished. The holiday season continues, even in mourning. As they filed out, Poirot remained behind, gazing at the riddle note once more. The answer had been simple, pencil-lead. But the real puzzle was far more complex. And the killer, he knew, was already planning the next move. Chapter 5. The Forged Label. The midday sun struggled to pierce the fog that still clung to the vineyards, casting a muted glow over the chateau. The police had arrived. An inspector from Bordeaux named Dupont, a stout man with a waxed moustache and a notebook that seemed perpetually open. He had taken statements, examined the body, now removed to the village morgue, and sealed the cellar with official tape. No one was to enter without his permission. Poirot, however, had requested, and received, a private moment in the cellars before the seal was applied. The inspector, aware of Poirot's reputation, had grudgingly agreed. 15 minutes, Monsieur Poirot. No touching evidence. Now Poirot descended the stone steps alone, the air cool and heavy, with the scent of old oak and fermenting grapes. The racks stretched into shadow, thousands of bottles sleeping in their cradles. He carried a small torch, its beam slicing through the gloom. He moved directly to the spot where Lord Hargrove had fallen, careful to step around the chalk outline still visible on the flagstones. The glass had been taken for analysis, but the bottle of 1929 Lafite remained on its small table, upright and undisturbed. Poirot lifted it gently, turning it in the light. The label was perfect. The deep red border, the elegant script, the year embossed subtly. He examined the cork, still sealed with wax, no sign of tampering. Yet something troubled him. He walked deeper into the cellar, past rows of Margaux, Pomerol, and Sauternes. His torch played over the racks until he found what he sought. Another bottle of 1929 Lafite, identical in every way, standing in its place, among the case Hargrove had purchased. Poirot drew it out carefully. The bottle felt the same weight, the cork the same. But as he turned it, the label caught the light differently. A faint irregularity in the printing, the curve of the F in Lafite slightly off, The paper a shade too bright. Forged. He compared the two bottles side by side. The genuine one bore the subtle imperfections of hand-applied glue from 1929. The second had the crisp uniformity of a modern reproduction. Someone had introduced a counterfeit into the collection. Poirot replaced the bottle and continued his search. In a far corner, behind a stack of empty crates, he found a small wooden box, half hidden. Inside lay several blank labels, a pot of glue, and a bottle of red ink. Amateurish, but effective. He closed the box and returned to the main aisle. The forgery was a red herring, perhaps, meant to confuse, to suggest that Hargrove had been cheated in life as well as death. Or perhaps it pointed to motive, someone who knew the cellar intimately enough to attempt such a deception. He ascended the stairs, the box tucked under his arm. The others had gathered in the library, waiting for the inspector's next move. Lady Eleanor stood by the window, staring out at the vines. Vicomte de Montfort smoked a cigarette, his back to the fire. Captain Thorne paced, restless. Miss Langford sat at a small table, writing furiously in her notebook. Lefebvre hovered near the door, as if guarding the threshold to the cellars. Poirot entered without fanfare, placing the box on the central table. "Monsieur Lefebvre," he said quietly, "perhaps you can explain this." Lefebvre's face drained of color. "That is, I do not know how it came to be there. Yet you have access to the cellars at all hours. You know every bottle." "I swear, Monsieur Poirot, I have never forged a label in my life. The wines are sacred." Poirot opened the box. "The glue is fresh. The ink still smells. Someone has been busy." Captain Thorne stepped forward. "A fake Lafitte? Uncle Reggie would have noticed in a heartbeat." "Perhaps he did," Poirot said. "Perhaps that is why he went down alone last night, to confront the forger." Vicomte de Montfort exhaled smoke slowly. "Or perhaps the forger killed him to prevent discovery." Poirot turned to Miss Langford. "You kept the inventory, mademoiselle. Did you note any discrepancies?" She shook her head. "Lord Hargrove handled the most valuable bottles himself. I only catalogued the rest." Poirot nodded. "And yet the forgery is skilled enough to fool a casual glance, but not an expert, someone with knowledge of wine labels." His gaze settled on Lefebvre. "You are the expert." The cellar master shook his head violently. "I would never disgrace the wines with a forgery." Poirot closed the box. "We shall see." He moved to the fireplace. The poison was not in the bottle. We know this. The glass was laced. But the killer wished to draw attention to the cellar, to the vintage. The forgery serves that purpose. It suggests theft, deceit, something larger than a simple murder. Lady Eleanor spoke, her voice cold. "Or it suggests that Reginald discovered the fake and was killed for it." "Precisely," Poirot said. "But who could have placed the poison in the glass? The killer had to know Hargrove would pour from that bottle, and that he would drink alone." Miss Langford looked up. "He always tasted the Lafitte first. It was his ritual." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And who prepared the decanter for him last night?" Lefebvre stiffened. "I did. As always. I decanted it at 7 o'clock. Then left the decanter on the sideboard in the dining room. He took it down himself. So the poison could have been added to the decanter," Poirot said. "Not the glass. The decanter." A murmur rippled through the room. Captain Thorne frowned. "Then anyone could have done it. The decanter sat out for hours." "But only one person knew Hargrove would use it last night," Poirot replied. "And that person is the killer." He looked at each of them in turn. "The forgery is a distraction. The real clue is in the preparation. Tonight we dine. And we shall test the theory." The inspector knocked at the door, impatient. "Time, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot bowed slightly. "Thank you for the indulgence, Inspector." As they left the library, Lefebvre lingered, staring at the box as if it were a venomous snake. Poirot paused beside him. You love the wines, monsieur, more than the man who owned them? Chapter 6. The Betrayed Secret. The afternoon passed in a heavy hush. The police inspector had departed for Bordeaux with samples of the glass, the decanter, and the forged labels, promising to return the following morning with preliminary results. The chateau felt emptier without Lord Hargrove's booming voice, yet fuller with suspicion. Servants moved like shadows, avoiding the guests' eyes. Poirot had withdrawn to the small sitting room adjoining the library, where he now sat alone with a cup of strong black coffee and a plate of untouched biscuits. He stared at the fire, letting the little grey cells work in their methodical way. The forgery had been a distraction, yes, but a deliberate one. Someone had wished to muddy the waters, to suggest a larger conspiracy when the truth was simpler and more personal. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Miss Beatrice Langford stood in the doorway, her notebook absent for the first time since Poirot's arrival. She looked smaller, almost fragile, in the dim light. "May I speak with you, Monsieur Poirot? Privately." He rose at once, gesturing to the chair opposite his own. "Of course, mademoiselle. Sit. You are pale. You have not eaten." She shook her head and remained standing. "I cannot keep silent any longer. It is eating me inside." Poirot waited, patient as stone. She drew a shaky breath. "Lord Hargrove, Reginald, was my father." The words hung between them, simple and devastating. Poirot inclined his head. "I suspected as much." The resemblance in the eyes, the quiet devotion, the way he watched you when he thought no one noticed. "Continue, please." "My mother was a housemaid here when she was young. She left the chateau before anyone knew she was with child. Reginald supported us quietly. Money sent through solicitors, a good school in England, later this position as secretary. He never acknowledged me openly. He said the scandal would destroy his reputation, his marriage. But he promised. He promised that when the time was right, he would change everything. The codicil in his will was to be the beginning. He told me so only last month." Her voice cracked. "He said he was tired of hiding. He wanted to claim me as his daughter before the holiday season ended. He was going to announce it at the vintage tasting, make it a celebration, a new beginning." Poirot's expression softened, though his eyes remained sharp. "And Lady Eleanor knew?" Miss Langford nodded. "She found out 2 weeks ago. She overheard us speaking in the study. She confronted him that night. I heard them arguing through the door. She called me names I had never heard spoken aloud. She threatened to ruin me, to have me dismissed without reference, to make sure no one in Bordeaux society would ever employ me again. And Lord Hargrove, he defended me. He told her the marriage had been empty for years, that he intended to make amends. He said he would not be bullied." Poirot leaned forward slightly. So Lady Eleanor had motive, stronger than mere jealousy. She stood to lose not only her husband's affection, but her position, her social standing, perhaps even the London house if the will were rewritten entirely. Miss Langford's hands twisted together. "But I did not kill him. I swear it. I wanted him alive. I wanted the acknowledgement, the name, the family I had never known." Poirot studied her. "You were upstairs last night, you say, in your room?" "Yes. I was reading correspondence. The maid can confirm it. And yet," Poirot said gently, "you knew his routine. You knew he would go to the cellar alone. You had access to the decanter before Lefebvre took it downstairs." She shook her head fiercely. "I would never, never." Poirot rose and walked to the window. The fog had cleared at last. The vineyards lay exposed under a pale winter sun, rows of gnarled vines like old men waiting for spring. "Mademoiselle, I believe you. Your grief is genuine, but grief can blind us to truth. Someone used your secret. Someone counted on it to create confusion." He turned back to her, Lady Eleanor's threat. Did she speak of poison? No. But she said some secrets were better buried, that certain stains could never be washed away. Poirot nodded slowly. A dangerous phrase. Miss Langford looked at him, eyes pleading. What will happen now? The police. If they learn this, they will learn it, Poirot said. Secrets do not stay buried in a house of this size. But I will ensure they learn it from me, and in the proper light. You are not the killer. Mademoiselle, your motive died with him. She gave a small, broken nod and left the room, shoulders bowed. Poirot remained by the window for several minutes. The pieces were falling into place, yet one still eluded him. The precise mechanism, the moment of decision, the forgery, the legend of the curse, the riddle, all distractions. The heart of the matter was human, fragile and bitter. Downstairs the others were gathering for tea. Voices drifted up the stairwell, Lady Eleanor's cool tones, the Vicomte's smooth laughter, Captain Thorne's restless pacing. Lefebvre was absent, no doubt in the locked cellar, mourning his master and his wines. Poirot touched his moustache, a small gesture of satisfaction. The little grey cells had not been idle. Tonight, at dinner, he would begin to draw the net tighter. And the killer, whoever it was, would feel the first true pressure of the trap closing. Chapter 7. The False Clue. The dining room was lit only by candles, their flames flickering in the draught that slipped under the heavy doors. The long mahogany table had been set for 6, as it had been the night before, though one place remained empty. Lord Hargrove's chair at the head stood vacant, a silent reminder. The silver gleamed dully. The crystal caught the light like frozen tears. No one spoke of the absence. Poirot had insisted on dinner despite the circumstances. We must maintain the routine, he had said. The killer expects us to unravel. Let us not give him or her that satisfaction. Lady Eleanor presided at the foot of the table, her face composed, though her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her wine-glass. Vicomte de Montfort sat to her right, his movements precise, his smile polite but strained. Captain Thorne was on the opposite side, pushing food around his plate without eating. Miss Langford, seated next to Poirot, kept her eyes on her lap. Lefebvre had been invited to join them, a rare honor. He sat at the far end, stiff and uncomfortable in his black suit. The first course, clear consommé, was served in silence. Then Poirot spoke. Tonight, we continue our investigation. The police will return tomorrow with results from the decanter, but I have already formed certain conclusions. Captain Thorne looked up sharply. And they are? Poirot set down his spoon. First, the forgery in the cellar. It was clumsy, yes, but deliberate. Someone wished us to believe there was theft, perhaps embezzlement. Yet the forger was not the killer. The forgery was planted to distract. He turned to Lefebvre. You have been quiet, monsieur. Too quiet. You knew of the fake label. Lefebvre's fork clattered against his plate. I discovered it yesterday morning, before the death. I intended to tell my lord, but he was already gone. Why did you not speak sooner? I feared suspicion would fall on me. The police, they would think I forged it to sell the real bottle. Poirot nodded. A reasonable fear. But the forgery was recent. The glue was still fresh. You could have removed it, replaced it with the genuine label. Yet you did not. Lefebvre looked down. I was afraid. Lady Eleanor spoke, her voice cool. Perhaps you should have been. You had access to everything. Poirot raised a hand. Patience, Lady Eleanor. We come now to another matter. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. This was found in Lord Hargrove's pocket this morning when the doctor examined the body. A suicide note. Captain Thorne leaned forward. A what? Poirot unfolded the paper. The handwriting was bold, familiar, Lord Hargrove's own. I can no longer bear the weight of my secrets. The curse of the vintage has found me at last. Forgive me. Poirot looked around the table. The handwriting is his, but the note is false. Comte de Montfort frowned. How can you be certain? The ink, it is too fresh. The paper is from his study, but the pen used was not his favorite. His Mont Blanc has a slight leak. This writing is clean. Someone forged it. Miss Langford's hand flew to her mouth. A suicide note. To cover the murder. Precisely, Poirot said. The killer hoped we would accept the legend of the curse, the suicide, and close the case quickly. But the forger made one mistake. The paper was torn from the bottom of a sheet. The top part remained on the desk. A letter Lord Hargrove had begun writing to his solicitor, dated yesterday. The tear marks match. He placed the note beside the torn fragment from the desk, brought earlier by the maid. The edges aligned perfectly. Lady Eleanor's face paled. Then the killer was in the study after Reginald went downstairs last night. Or before, Poirot said. But the note was placed in his pocket after death. The body was moved slightly. See the smudge on the jacket where the paper was slipped in. Captain Thorne stood abruptly. This is madness. Who would forge a suicide note? Someone who feared the truth would be discovered too quickly, Poirot replied. Someone with access to the study. Someone who knew his handwriting well. His gaze rested on Miss Langford. She shook her head. I did not write it, I swear. Poirot smiled faintly. I know, mademoiselle. Your handwriting is smaller, more precise. This forgery is bolder, more masculine. He turned to Captain Thorne. Captain, you have a steady hand. You have practiced your uncle's signature before, have you not? For checks, perhaps. Thorne flushed. That was years ago. I was young. And yet, Poirot continued, your alibi is not ironclad. You claim you played cards until midnight, but the footman who played with you said you left the table briefly to fetch another bottle of brandy. You were gone 10 minutes. Thorne's jaw tightened. I did not kill him. Poirot nodded. Perhaps not. But the note was forged to protect someone, or something. He rose from the table. We shall now reenact the events of last night, in the cellar, with all of you present. Lefebvre's eyes widened. The cellar is sealed. The inspector gave me permission for this purpose. Come. They followed him down the stone stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The police tape had been cut. A single electric lantern burned on the table where the Lafitte bottle still stood. Poirot arranged them in a circle around the spot where Hargrove had died. Lord Hargrove came down alone. He poured from the decanter into the glass. He drank. He fell. He looked at each face in turn. One of you knew this would happen. One of you prepared the decanter, and one of you placed the false note to make it seem like suicide. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant drip of water in the vaults. Poirot's voice was soft, almost gentle. Tonight, the net tightens, and in the flickering lantern light, the killer's shadow grew longer. Chapter 8. The Reenactment. The cellar air hung thick and chill, like a breath held too long. The electric lantern cast long shadows across the stone walls, turning the wine racks into skeletal sentinels. Poirot stood at the center of the chalked outline on the flagstones, the decanter, now empty and rinsed, poised on the small table beside the untouched bottle of 1929 Lafitte. He had positioned each suspect precisely. Lady Eleanor near the staircase, her face a mask of disdain. Vicomte de Montfort leaning against a rack, cigarette unlit between his fingers. Captain Thorne pacing a tight circle, fists clenched. Miss Langford clutching her arms as if to ward off the cold. Lefebvre beside the table, eyes fixed on the decanter like a mourner at a grave. We begin, Poirot said, his voice echoing softly. It is last night, 10 o'clock. Lord Hargrove has excused himself from the drawing-room. He descends these stairs. candle in hand. He pauses here, at the door, listening. No one follows. He mimed the action, cupping an ear toward the shadows above. The group watched in uneasy silence, the only sound the faint hum of the lantern. He approaches the table. He sees the decanter, prepared earlier by Monsieur Lefebvre, as is the custom. He pours. Poirot lifted the decanter, tilting it slowly over an empty glass. The motion was deliberate, almost ritualistic. One measure, perhaps two. He raises the glass to the light, admires the color, the deep ruby of the vintage. He inhales the bouquet, cassis, tobacco, a whisper of truffle. Lady Eleanor shifted. "This is theatrical, Monsieur Poirot. What does it prove?" "Patience," he replied, without looking at her. He drinks. The first sip warms him. The second seals his fate. He staggers, clutches his throat. He falls here. Poirot stepped back into the outline, collapsing to one knee with exaggerated slowness, then rising smoothly. But wait! The body was found with the glass upright beside him. No spill. He did not knock it over in his convulsions. Vicomte de Montfort frowned. Perhaps he set it down before the poison took full effect. Or perhaps, Poirot said, the glass was placed thereafter, by the killer, to complete the scene. Captain Thorne stopped pacing. "You're saying one of us came down after him, moved the body?" Poirot nodded. "Precisely. The strychnine acts in minutes, but the final spasms can last longer." The killer waited, listened from the stairs, then entered, placed the glass, slipped the forged note into the pocket, and left the door ajar for discovery. Miss Langford's voice was a whisper. "But why?" "To make it look like suicide. Oui, to invoke the curse, the legend, to suggest despair over some secret shame. But the killer made a mistake. The candle had burned low, but not out. Hargrove lit it upon entering. Fresh wick, even flame. Yet when found, it was guttered, wax pooled. Someone extinguished it hastily." He turned to Lefebvre. "You, monsieur, with your knowledge of the cellars, you could have slipped in through the side vault unseen." Lefebvre shook his head. "I was in my quarters above the kitchens. The cook will vouch for me." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And you, Captain, your 10-minute absence from the card game, enough time to descend, poison the decanter earlier, wait, then return to stage the scene." Thorne's face hardened. "I told you, I fetched brandy. Brandy from the sideboard, not from the cellar. The footman lied to protect you, perhaps, or you to protect yourself." Lady Eleanor interjected, her tone icy. "This is absurd. I was in the drawing-room with the Vicomte until midnight. We spoke of the tasting." De Montfort nodded. "True, though I did step out for air. 5 minutes, no more. The fog was thick. I could barely see the vines." Poirot smiled thinly. 5 minutes to the side door, 2 to the cellar via the service passage. Ample time. Miss Langford trembled. "And I was alone in my room, but you knew the routine best of all," Poirot said gently. "The daughter who waited for acknowledgement. The secretary who typed every letter, every will. You could have added the poison to the decanter at 7, when it sat unguarded. Tears welled in her eyes. I loved him." The reenactment hung in the charged air, each accusation a thread pulling tighter. Poirot circled them slowly, his gaze piercing. "Now, we test the decanter. Imagine it full. Who touched it last, before Lefebvre decanted the wine?" Lefebvre spoke haltingly. "I polished it myself at 6, then left it on the sideboard." Captain Thorne shrugged. "I passed it but didn't touch." Lady Eleanor hesitated. I dusted the table at 6:30. My hands were idle." De Montfort lit his cigarette at last. "I admired it during aperitifs. Brushed it with a finger." Miss Langford whispered, "I filled it with water earlier, to test for sediment, but it was empty when I left. Poirot stopped before the table. All of you then. Opportunity for all. But the poison, strychnine crystals, odorless in wine, dissolve quickly. Added to the decanter, it would taint every pore. Yet only Hargrove drank from it last night. The rest of you sipped from opened bottles at dinner. Safe. He lifted the decanter, turning it in the lantern light. A faint residue clung to the base, traces missed by the rinsing. The police will confirm, but I see it now. The killer did not poison the decanter. A gasp rippled through them. The glass, Poirot continued. Hargrove poured into his own glass, brought from upstairs. The killer anticipated this, laced the glass beforehand, knowing he would rinse it in the cellar sink and pour fresh. The poison waited, patient as a spider. Lady Eleanor's composure cracked. His glass, from the drawing room. We. And who cleared the table after aperitifs? Who handled the glasses? Silence, thick as the shadows. Lefebvre's voice broke it, small and defeated. I did, but only to wash them later. Poirot's eyes locked on him, or to poison one. The devoted servant, preserving his treasures from a master who would sell them. The cellar seemed to contract, the walls pressing in. Upstairs, the clock struck 10, echoing the hour of death. The reenactment was over, but the truth was just beginning to emerge, and in Lefebvre's eyes, Poirot saw the first flicker of fear. Chapter 9. The Revelation. The lantern's light seemed to dim, as if the cellar itself recoiled from the truth. The suspects stood frozen in their positions, faces pale in the yellow glow. Poirot moved slowly, deliberately, back to the center of the chalked outline. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, almost gentle. Mes amis, the moment has come. The little grey cells have spoken. He turned first to Lady Eleanor. You had motive, the scorned wife, the threatened inheritance, the fear of scandal. But your hands are clean. You were in the drawing-room with the Vicomte, and your grief, though theatrical, is genuine. Lady Eleanor exhaled, a small sound of relief. Poirot shifted his gaze to Vicomte de Montfort. You coveted the Lafitte, the prestige. Envy is a powerful poison, but not yours. Your alibi is solid, and your ambition never turned to murder. The Vicomte inclined his head, a faint smile touching his lips. Captain Thorne, Poirot continued, your debts, your resentment, your brief absence, all pointed to you. The forged suicide note, too, bore the mark of a man who has practiced his uncle's signature. But you did not kill him. Your grief is real, and your card game, though interrupted, was witnessed by 3 footmen. Thorne's shoulders sagged, the tension draining from him. Miss Langford stood last in the circle, eyes wide and wet. Poirot looked at her with kindness. Mademoiselle, your secret was the deepest wound. The daughter denied, the promise broken. Yet you loved him too much to harm him. Your alibi holds. You are innocent. She covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling. Poirot turned at last to Monsieur Jacques Lefebvre. The cellar-master had not moved, his face grey, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. And you, Monsieur Lefebvre, Poirot said quietly, you loved the wines more than life itself. 30 years in these vaults, every bottle a child, every vintage a masterpiece. Lord Hargrove spoke of selling the collection, part of it at least, to settle debts. You overheard him in the study, arguing with his solicitor on the telephone. You knew the cellars would be scattered, your life's work destroyed. Lefebvre's voice was a rasp. He would have ruined it all. Poirot nodded. You prepared the decanter, as always. But this time, you added the strychnine crystals to the glass he always used, the one he brought down himself. You knew his ritual. Rinse the glass in the sink, pour fresh from the decanter. The poison waited in the residue of the rinse water, invisible, odorless. Perfect. Lefebvre's head bowed. I could not let him destroy the vintage. The forgery, Poirot continued, was your attempt to divert suspicion, to suggest theft, a rival collector. But the glue was too fresh, the labels too new. Amateur work from a man who knows wine, not paper. And the suicide note, Poirot said. You forged after the deed. You slipped downstairs while the others dined, placed it in his pocket, extinguished the candle. You spread whispers of the curse, hoping we would accept it. But the tear marks betrayed you, and the ink was still wet. Eyes glistening. I never meant for it to be painful. Strychnine. I thought it would be quick. It was not, Poirot said softly. But the end is here. Lefebvre sank to his knees among the racks, surrounded by the bottles he had guarded for decades. The wines are innocent, he whispered. They always were. Poirot placed a hand on the man's shoulder, a rare gesture of compassion. Order and method have prevailed. You will answer to the law, Monsieur Lefebvre, but the cellars will endure. He turned to the others. The vintage tasting will proceed tomorrow, as planned. Not in celebration, but in tribute. The 1929 Lafite will be poured, and we will remember the man who loved it. The group filed silently up the stairs, leaving Lefebvre alone with the shadows. Poirot lingered a moment longer, gazing at the racks. Rest well, old friend, he murmured to the bottles. Your secrets are safe. Outside, the winter night had cleared. Stars pricked the sky above the Medoc, and the fog had finally lifted. The holiday season, though shadowed, was not yet over. Chapter 10. The Resolution. The morning of Christmas Eve dawned crisp and clear over the Medoc. The fog had vanished entirely, leaving the vineyards bathed in pale winter sunlight that turned the bare vines to silver. Inside Chateau d'Yquem-sur-Mer, the air carried the scent of pine from the small tree the servants had brought in the night before, and the faint aroma of roasting chestnuts. The holiday season had refused to be entirely eclipsed by tragedy. The police had returned at first light. Inspector Dupont, notebook in hand, listened as Poirot recounted the events of the previous evening. Lefebvre, handcuffed and quiet, was led away without resistance. He spoke only once, to the inspector. The wines will be safe now. The gendarmes took him into the Renault that had brought Poirot 2 days earlier, and the car disappeared down the gravel drive. The household gathered in the drawing room. Lady Eleanor stood by the window, gazing out at the vineyards. Captain Thorne sat on the arm of a chair, his uniform jacket unbuttoned. Vicomte de Montfort poured coffee from a silver pot. Miss Langford, eyes red but composed, arranged the papers on the desk. Lord Hargrove's will, the codicil, the riddle note. Poirot entered last, his overcoat neatly folded over his arm. It is done, he said simply. The killer has confessed. The motive was love, not for a person, but for a legacy. Monsieur Lefebvre could not bear the thought of the cellar being dispersed. Lady Eleanor turned. And the will? The codicil? Miss Langford spoke softly. Lord Hargrove intended to change it. The envelope in the study contains instructions to his solicitor. He wished to acknowledge me as his daughter, to leave me a share of the estate. But he never signed the final document. Captain Thorne looked at her. Then the inheritance falls to me. But I don't want it all. Not like this. Poirot smiled faintly. Lord Hargrove's riddle was the true legacy. I am taken from a mine and shut up in a wooden case, from which I am never released, and yet I am used by almost everybody. The answer is pencil-lead, graphite. He meant that true value lies in knowledge, in appreciation, not in possession. He gestured toward the window. The cellars remain intact. The 1929 Lafite will be tasted today, as planned, not in celebration of death, but in remembrance of life. The vintage tasting proceeded in the Great Hall. A smaller affair than originally intended. The local vintners, the mayor, the journalists, all had been informed of the tragedy and chose to attend in quiet respect. The bottle was opened with ceremony. Lefebvre's assistant, a young man who had trained under him, performed the decanting. The wine poured deep and luminous into the glasses. The bouquet rose, black currant, cedar, a hint of spice. They drank in silence, each lost in thought. Poirot raised his glass, filled with tisane, as always. To the vintage of the century, and to the man who cherished it. The glasses clinked softly. Outside, the sun climbed higher, warming the stone walls of the chateau. The vineyards stretched away, patient and enduring, waiting for spring. As the guests departed, Poirot stood on the terrace, watching the Renault return to fetch him. The driver waited patiently. Captain Thorne approached. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you. For justice, for clarity." Poirot inclined his head. It was nothing, merely order restored. Miss Langford joined them. "I will stay, to care for the cellars, to honor what he wanted." Poirot looked at her. "You will make him proud, mademoiselle." Lady Eleanor appeared last, wrapped in furs. "I shall return to London, but I will not sell the chateau. Not yet." She extended a hand to Poirot. "You have my gratitude." He took it gently. "And you have my respect, Lady Eleanor." The Renault's engine hummed. Poirot stepped inside, settling into the leather seat. As the car pulled away, he looked back at the chateau, its windows glowing in the afternoon light. The holiday vintage mystery was solved. The cellars slept on, their treasures safe. And Hercule Poirot, with a small, satisfied smile beneath his moustache, turned his thoughts toward Paris. "Order and method," he murmured to himself. "Always."